no interviewee thinks they're going to do a bad interview. We know that, Christina. But amplify that when you've been brought up in that world, the space I feel between his capabilities and what he might have thought they were was obviously vast.
I mean, how did Prince Andrew feel after the interview? Did he feel like it went well? And is it true that he gave everybody a tour of the palace? So he must have felt that things went well after this interview.
Well, there was this extraordinary moment where the interview ends. I had been looking at the floor by the end, I must be honest, because you're trying not to make eye contact, right? You know how that goes. And one of the people who worked with him was sitting next to me, and I didn't really know what to say because I'm terrible at being disingenuous. And having been a lawyer and a journalist, that's quite a burden. So I didn't know what to say. So I formulated my sentence very carefully. And I said, so, slightly high-pitched voice, how do you think it went? And then she went, wasn't he marvelous? And in all sincerity, Christina, I said, yes, he was. And as my eyes lifted, the extraordinary parting of the ways. On one side, the journalists who knew this was an absolute unmitigated disaster. And on the other side, Prince Andrew, who, as you accurately described, invited all of us on a tour. I didn't go. I felt, that was something that Emily is so good at. But had he asked me, I would have found it very difficult to answer the question, how did it go? Because we'd had such a good rapport. So that's right. Off they went. Did a really nice long tour. He seemed to be in extremely good spirits, while we were basically ashen because we could not believe what had just happened.
Did the BBC, once this aired and once, the backlash came for him and people's jaws were on the floor after watching this interview, did the palace reach out and be like, we don't want this aired? Can you cut this interview? Did that ever happen? Or did you ever receive any contact from Prince Andrew after the interview aired?
Well, my expectation would have been basically fake your own death, do anything to get out of this, anything, right? That's the bar, Christina, that was not a good interview. So my expectation was certainly that there would be machinations or attempts. To be frank, they behaved extraordinarily well. There was never any recrimination. There was never any attempt to do anything about the interview. They behaved as if once it was done, that was that. So no lawyers, no nothing. Really an extraordinary way to behave magnanimously, obviously, in quite difficult circumstances for them and for the palace.
I mean, we very rarely see any members of the royal family come out and speak like this. I mean, they have the motto, never complain, never explain. So were you shocked at the depth that he went into and the details that he did, the not showing remorse and things like that? Were you just astounded by the way a royal was acting in public and going into such great depth about his situation?
Yes, I think as my two brains as journalist and ex-lawyer were both on fire, because obviously the things that he was saying, if they were untrue, were quite easy to disprove. They were not good explanations if they were lies. And so the journalist brain and the lawyer brain are just sitting there going, hold on a minute. Now, I'd had no previous contact with the family or the royal family. In my job, I tend to book CEOs, world leaders, celebrities, but I'd had no royal connection. And having spoken to royal correspondents now over these past couple of years, they're blown away by the way I behaved. For better or worse, I'm not sure. But I just had no expectation of what should or could happen. So all through the negotiation with me and then with Emily and latterly with Stuart, we were just treating him like any other Newsnight interviewee. If you're going to be on camera, we'll treat you fairly, but rigorously. And obviously, he didn't respond well to the rigor.
Right. Do you think that's maybe what made him feel comfortable in doing the interview in the first place? Because maybe you didn't treat him like a regular royal and kind of get swept up in the royal hoopla of the whole thing. Do you think that's maybe why he felt comfortable to do this interview?
I think that negotiation is always a matter of trust. Mm-hmm. And for better or worse throughout my career, my integrity is everything. So when we're conversing with somebody, you just put it on the line. And that often means you lose an interview because I was always frank. And so sometimes I would say things that were to my disadvantage. But I suspect he wasn't used to being spoken to. And I don't mean we were rude to him or anything, but we're not deferential people. So if there was any deference in that room, it certainly, as you can probably tell, was not coming from me. Mm-hmm. So it was a conversation, as far as I was concerned, between equals. And it was a matter for him to draw his own conclusions as to whether or not this was a good idea. That's literally what I said to him. He asked me if it was a good idea to do the interview, a terrible question to ask a negotiator. And my answer was, yeah, only you know whether it's a good idea. The questions are going to be fair. How good are your answers going to be? And no interviewee thinks they're going to do a bad interview. We know that, Christina. But amplify that when you've been brought up in that world, the space I feel between his capabilities and what he might have thought they were was obviously vast.
Right. I mean, do you feel like he was kind of shell shocked in the middle of in that interview, being like, I did not think that these questions would be so specific, so hard? Do you think that he was a little taken aback, or do you think that he just kind of, thought everything was fine, like you said?
Yeah, I think he thought he did well. I really do. I think it's hard to understand the ramifications of your words when you're not used to being accountable. Let's imagine that had been a CEO, for example. He or she, their career would have been in ruins within seconds, and the shares would have dropped off the face of the FTSE, right? It would have been all over for that company. There aren't the same ramifications when you have not had to do a traditional job or gone through a traditional education or been sacked or knocked back or embarrassed or even done an appraisal. You know, the guy's never had an appraisal. So I think that there is a misunderstanding about your own capabilities, and obviously untethered, that can, in these kinds of circumstances, create a cataclysmic interview. But it could have been different, but it wasn't.
For more news, content, and exclusive interviews, make sure to hit the sub, like, and bell button down below and visit usmagazine.com.